Bob is in a class for gifted children, where he's a disturbing element, frequently clowning and talking out of turn. Bob occasionally wets his bed, has temper tantrums, and cannot accept limitations. He's an unhappy child and is avoided by other children. Bob slept in the parental bedroom until the birth of a younger sibling, when he was 5, at which time he began to neglect his appearance and refused to bathe. According to his mother, the boy has always been restless and extremely hyperactive. The mother is an over-anxious, inconsistent, inadequate person who has invested a great deal in the boy's school achievement. The father's warm, but has a quick temper. Bob likes his father.
Bob seems to be reacting to his mother's basic rejection of him for the younger sibling. Is that right?
Yes, the mother impressed me as a person who felt deeply inadequate as a wife and as a mother.
We will accept Bob for exclusive group therapy. The unconditional acceptance by and the relationship with the therapist, together with free acting out of his impulses and aggressions in a permissive environment, should serve to counteract the boy's feelings of insecurity and stabilize his behavior. However, little can be done for this child, in my opinion, without enlisting the cooperation of the mother, and she should be referred for treatment as well.
When the boys arrive, the therapist introduces them to one another. He does not, however, suggest projects or occupations. At the first session, the boys attach themselves to the therapist and follow him about. After a period of acclimatization, contact is made among the boys. This is the beginning step in breaking down isolation. After a while, if left alone, each finds something that interests him. This is Henry, the boy who has an inordinate fear of children. Note the anxious sucking movements of his lips. The therapist attempts to make him feel at ease. He introduces Henry to the other boys, but this makes Henry even more uncomfortable. Sensing this, the therapist leaves him and returns to helping one of the boys. This is good for Henry, for he sees the therapist as a helpful, positive person. The boy who is running is Bob. The free atmosphere of the group encourages him to act out his hyperactivity and distractibility, two of the main problems for which he was referred. The therapist now withdraws completely from the activity, letting the group take over. Henry withdraws into isolation, aimlessly working a dry paintbrush back and forth.
Till 5:30, all right, Mike? Until what time do we get back? 6:30.
We'll have our first
7 o'clock. 8 o'clock. Oh. Midnight. What time is it?
Just as expected in these groups, an overt struggle suddenly breaks out.
I'm supposed to leave that you over here. I mean, I take it back. I need the heavy one. This is the one I love. Wait, what's that? See, Mommy? Who said my name was Tom? It'll be fun. When I get to with you. Oh, yeah? Oh, yeah. Half an hour.
The struggle is resolved, and the adult did not interfere.
It's a mirror. I know mirror.
After a while, the more resistive youngsters are won over by the food and by the therapist's permissive attitude.
Look, what's the mirror? Oh, I know what kind of mirror this is. The mirror on one side and the window on the other.
When it's time to end the session, the therapist does not tell the boys to leave. Instead, he is put on his coat as a form of suggestion. Most of the boys soon leave, including Henry, who has not spoken a single word during the entire 2-hour session. Bob and Robert stay on dawdling, passively defying the therapist, and again testing him. The therapist lets the boys take their time, once more passing the test.
Holy cow, it's light out. I know.
So, I'll see you next Tuesday.
Let me in.
Oh, I'll come back later. I'll see you next Tuesday. All right?
Wait a minute.
You want to leave here?
Well, I'll finish it.
Good night.
But how did you become interested in group psychotherapy?
Well, actually, I didn't become interested in group psychotherapy because when we started, there had been no group psychotherapy. Group psychotherapy was started in 1934 with youngsters at the Jewish Board of Guardians in New York City. And interestingly enough, we didn't start it as group psychotherapy. We started it as sort of progressive education or progressive recreation for selected difficult young girls, young teenage girls. Therapy was not intended at all through the group method. But these girls were very unhappy, maladjusted, had no friends, and couldn't make any friends in the neighborhood, and were difficult to reach by individual big sisters, actually. They were not clinical patients. So I suggested that we might be able to reach them through some creative activities, experience with which I've had rather extensively.
And today I'm interviewing Dr. Aaron Stein at the American Group Psychotherapy Conference in Detroit in 1973. And I'd like to start off our conversation, Aaron, by asking you how you got interested in being a therapist and doing group therapy.
Well, it goes back a long time. Even before I went into practice, even in medical school, I was interested in psychiatry and in doing therapy. And I got into group therapy because one of my residencies, psychiatric residencies, in 1942 was at Hillside Hospital with Louis Wender, who was one of the pioneers in group therapy. And that's where I learned from him, that's where I saw it in operation, and I've been using it since then. And from the first, I found it a very useful form of therapy for some patients and as a supplement for other patients. And I've continued to work in group therapy since then, and returned to Hillside after the war and set up a group therapy program there, and returned to Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, where I had also been a resident, and set up a group therapy program there.
Weren't you looked at in terms of going into groups being something of a maverick, or wasn't group therapy at that point still somewhat looked at askance, questioned seriously?
Very much so. At the beginnings, in the early 40s, the leading group in American psychiatry was the psychoanalytic group, and they raised many questions about group therapy, so much so that an article written in 1941 placed it with unorthodox religious movements and various other things. And early in the 1940s, when group therapy was being used in New York, the Jewish Board of Guardians, the analytic group raised so many questions about it that a commission was appointed to study whether it was an ethical and useful form of treatment. And Slafson was one of the people involved in this. But after the 1940s, certainly after the late 1940s, it became increasingly accepted as a valid form of
experiences for you in groups that have represented turning points in your thinking? Have there been things that have happened as a result of a group experience with particular groups that has changed your thinking over the years?
An interaction was occurring between an older woman and a younger woman in the group, and all of a sudden it became clear to me and also to the members of the group that what was being reenacted was a scene between mother and daughter, which had been sort of hinted at before, but here it was really demonstrated before your eyes. And this was one of the fruitful points where I could begin to see how transference manifestations would become apparent in the member-to-member interaction and become useful for the treatment.
But I was wondering, you got into doing therapy and sort of what the history is.
Well, it's very interesting. You know, I was a student at the Jewish Board of Guardians, which is a child guidance clinic where Sam Slafson had developed his group therapy. And it must have been a lucky coincidence, or maybe he perceived some potential while I was still a student of social work, and I was about to graduate and looking for a job. He said, "Would you like to work with me?" And this occurred in 1944. And it's in that year I had my first therapy groups under his supervision, and he was my teacher. And it's in that way that I appeared in that film. Of course, I feel very self-conscious nowadays being in that film because, as you might have noticed, while I have lost some of the accent since that time, I've also lost a lot of my hair. But I really began kind of at the cradle of American group psychotherapy, which
Very
was
much so.
a very favorable development for me.
Yeah. Were you moving in the direction of being a therapist or working with people very early as a kid, or what?
It's very interesting that you asked me that. You know, I, in a sense, grew up in a group situation, and by that I don't mean the usual pat statement that I grew up in a family, which is a group. But almost since I was 7 or 8 years old, through my older sisters, I was a part of one of those independent European youth movements. This was called the Wandervogel. And when I say independent, it was independent. There were no adults. My leaders were college students. And in turn, very soon, I became a leader of other young people. And these were anti-bourgeois developments, movements, with a definite theme of revolt against the bourgeois reactionary tone of the then Middle European society. The particular group that I belonged to also had a Zionist tinge in reaction to some of the anti-Semitism I experienced. But the important part is that those were all small groups. And we studied educators, we studied Freud, we studied Pestalozzi, and used this in the way we influenced as our ego ideals some of the young people that worked with us. So when I came to America, I kind of had in my guts both the experience and the feeling that there's something very potent in working with young people, particularly through the group medium.
I'm John Gladfelder, and I want to introduce this morning Dr. Sam Haddon. We are meeting at the American Group Psychotherapy Association conference in New York City, February of 1972. Dr. Haddon, I'd like to talk to you about the early days and your early introduction to group psychotherapy and group psychotherapy in general. Do you remember your first interest in groups and how you got started?
Well, I got started without knowing I was being introduced to group psychotherapy even before I graduated from medical school. In the summer between my junior and senior year in medical school, I went to a tuberculosis sanitarium. And there, Dr. Joseph Walsh, who was one of my chiefs, utilized a group instructional and inspirational approach to the patients with pulmonary tuberculosis. He took a great deal of time to explain to them the nature of pulmonary tuberculosis, and the only way it could be healed was by giving the lung as much rest as it could be given. And one of the things he did was to utilize what is now commonly called progressive relaxation, and after I realized that it was through Dr. Walsh that I was inoculated, I told him one day that I thought it was a magnificent example of group hypnosis. I thought he was the best hypnotist I ever knew, and he almost had a fit. And I became head of the outpatient department at Episcopal and Presbyterian Hospital in Philadelphia. Our patient load was constantly increasing because whenever the patients exhausted, the patients of physicians in the cardiac or the GI clinic with their visceral symptoms, which were really based on emotional problems, they shipped them off to us. And we didn't have the manpower to really give them the kind of care they needed. And I several times discussed with my senior confreres the idea of bringing these patients into a group, not even relating it then to the old instructional type of group that I had observed at Whitehaven. But one day there was a medical meeting in town, and all of my associates in the dispensary wanted to make this medical meeting. And so I went over the charts and I doled out the organic lesions, Parkinsonians, convulsive disorders to my confreres, and I took the psychoneurotics that remained, took them into a classroom, and we had about an hour discussion with them. Now, the only thing I really remember about that first session was we tried to point out to them that their visceral symptoms were emotionally produced. And I used the example of fright, stage fright especially. Well, we finished up in time. We all got to the medical meeting. When I came into the hospital the following week, several of the patients who were at that first session jumped off the benches and went, "When are you going to talk to us again?" That helped me a great deal. And that's how it started.